Hello. I've decided today to talk about, I've done quite a few different hospitality ventures. Most of you probably know about the greenhouse. I did one in Melbourne in 2008, in Perth in 2009, Sydney in 2010, and then the Food and Wine Festival was the last one in 2012. But I've also done bars and cafes, the world's first completely zero waste cafe, which is called Silo. And that, once we did that after 3 years, I decided to change it because I wanted to take that whole idea to another level. And that's when I called my dear friend Neil Perry and I said, I want to build a restaurant that relies on your waste. And he said, yep, go for it. So I luckily had some really good restaurants, European, Attica, Ben Shiri's Attica, and Rockbull Group. And based on what I saw being thrown away in those restaurants, I decided to open a restaurant called Brothel. And it's actually not my idea to call it brothel. That was a doctor in the 1920s, a doctor called Weston Price, who worked out about 100 years before everybody else that the average American wasn't getting what they needed to live healthy lives from their food. So he was the head of the American Dental Institute and he traveled the world. He visited, over a period of 10 years, he visited primitive populations that hadn't changed their diet for at least a few hundred years, some like in Australian Aboriginals for thousands of years. And his conclusion was at the very end that the average American at the time got 1/10 of the nutrients from their food as what primitive people got. And he proved that he could completely close cavities in 4 weeks by simply increasing the nutrient density of a child's diet. And his work is now finally being recognized for what it is. And it's actually, that is at the heart of why I did Brothel. So what I did is I collected bones, I collected fish, skeletons, kelp. We had a forager who foraged for seaweed and kelp, and we made broth. We made vegetarian broth, we made beef bone broth, and as you guys in the room know, Rockpool gets some of the best beef in Australia. And we created this business. And I kind of didn't, I was really excited. I mean, this is the food that I eat at home, but I wasn't expecting it to be as, to go as well as what it did. And we got coverage all over the world, and we had some of the world's best chefs like Rene Redzepi and Alex Atala from Dom in in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And the New York Times really got fascinated by it. And this little restaurant actually inspired a guy who's now my friend, Dan Barber, to start the Wasted pop-ups. There was one in London last year, and there was one in New York 3 years ago. And what it basically is showing that we are wasting so much food. And I'll start with some of the systems that we had in place. So we had a milk system. So I contacted a dairy farm and I said, if I give you stainless steel, 20-litre stainless steel kegs, will you supply me in stainless steel kegs? Not a problem. So we had Australia's first biodynamic farm, Schultz Biodynamic Dairy, supplies cream and milk. And from that we churned butter and we used the milk. And he worked out that when we closed, it was equivalent to 130,000 milk bottles that he didn't need to buy and I didn't need to get rid of. We had wine. I was one of the very first people to, back in 2007, 2008, to get wine on tap. And so we had wine on tap, we had spirits, locally made gin, local whiskey, local vodka, all came in 20-litre stainless steel barrels. We had mineral water on tap from Hepburn Springs Mineral Water and in stainless steel kegs. So our food and beverage was able to be supplied without generating any waste. All our fruit and vegetables came in reusable plastic crates. We simply put them through the dishwasher and then every time we got new supplies, they came in. Our wheat came in bags that we simply cut the thread and then we would stone grind the wheat. We were going through about a ton of wheat every month. This place was only 45 square meters. So we were churning through a lot of wheat. Oats were rolled to order, and once a month we would simply stuff all the bags back into one bag and then we would post them back to the wheat farm. Now the wheat wasn't very local, it came from Western Australia, but I believe that Dale at Eden Valley Biodynamic grows the best wheat in the world, and I was determined to keep using it. So he used to just send me a pallet of wheat at a time, and that's what we stone ground. In the 3 years we were open, 140 tons of organic waste was composted in an in-vessel composter, the same composter that this hotel now has downstairs. I believe it's about 8 tons bigger than the one I had. But I'm not sure on the numbers, but I believe the Hyatt is composting something like 400 kilos of organic waste a day and turning that into 40 kilos of nutrient-dense compost. By us doing this at Brothel, it actually started something really big, and it meant that guys like Rene Redzepi, when he came, he was blown away. Within 8 weeks, he'd ordered one. So there was one on its way to Denmark. The Ledbury in London, there's now hundreds of these machines around the world, and more importantly, in Australia, it's finally starting to catch on. Organic waste does not belong in an incinerator, in waste to energy, or in landfill. It belongs back in our soil. And that goes back to what I was talking about at the start with Western Price. Our biggest problem we face today is that our food is not providing us what we need to live lives, healthy lives. Our fertility is declining fast. I have no doubt whatsoever that depression and anxiety completely linked to the lack of nutrients in our food. And it's because we've mined all the soils, all the world's soils, of the nutrients. You can't expect to just keep harvesting yield after yield after yield and expect that food to be nourishing you. And the only reason why we've been able to disguise this problem is because we invented something called synthetic fertilizer. That's a fertilizer made from gas. It provides 3 elements. Plants need over 100 elements to really nourish us. Zinc, selenium, iron, manganese, all the different elements that many of the doctors are now saying we need to have supplements of are because we used to get them from our food, but now we're not getting them from our food because, quite simply, we've extracted them from the soil. And just a really simple example that I'll explain, which might make you understand how we've pulled these from the soil. It's not just food, it's wool. Think about the millions of kilos of fibre that Australia has pulled out of the soil. Fibre is incredibly nutrient dense. That's come out of the soil. Wine, milk, all these products pull nutrients from the soil. In the late 1890s in Burgundy, there was a grape grower who had vines that were really suffering from powdery mildew. And it was along a walking track, a busy walking track, so he decided to spray copper on the vines to make them go that vibrant green, to stop people from picking them, because he didn't want people to get sick, because he felt that the mold was going to cause people, make people ill. What blew his mind was that he went past that vine a week later and it had completely recovered from the powdery mildew. That to me is one of the prime examples of the grapes over the 150 to 200 years that they'd been there had pulled every single trace of copper out of the ground. So when they needed it to fight that powdery mildew, it wasn't there. And that's the same with us. We are getting food that is not nourishing us, and that was what Brothel was about. I wanted to create the world's most nutrient-dense food that nourished people. And I love the fact that Chinese doctors in Melbourne were sending their clients to us for food. We had football players from some of the best football teams. People were just saying, this food makes me feel so good. And you know what? It's some of the oldest food on the planet. We've been making this stuff for thousands of years. So that's what Brothel was about. And yeah, now we're going to sit down and hopefully get some questions.
In preparation for meeting you, I was doing a little bit of research and I saw that a couple of frightening statistics. One being that in the next 50 years, we're going to have to grow more food than we have in the last 10,000. So how do you balance that amount of growth with what you've just been talking about with regards to the nutrients in the earth, and how does that then reflect on the industry that we have in the room?
Well, again, I don't think that there's really a problem with us running out of food. But the problem is that food no longer nourishes us. And obesity, I believe, is directly linked to the fact that your brain's starved for nutrients. Your brain's like going, I need more. It's not there, so you keep eating. And it might be looking for different elements, but once you eat nutrient-dense food, you can't eat too much of it. And you feel satisfied. And again, the problem is that we've got this agricultural method that we've been using for 7,000 to 8,000 years. We can't keep using that. And we're logging faster today than at any point in history. We are logging, I think, something like 3 acres every 10 seconds of old-growth forest, just because we need more land to grow more food. Then we just spoke about the Rialto Tower, which is the biggest office tower here in Melbourne. I think there's about 1.5 hectares of glass facade that faces north. I know of friends that are getting 70 kilos of tomatoes per square metre. So can you imagine how many tomatoes a building like that could grow? It would also then cool the building, which it's spending a fortune on cooling the building. The building's also sending out 500,000 litres of grey water every day. So when people say, oh, we don't have enough water, it's just that we're not using all the different elements properly. And last year, we used 100 million tonnes. We use gas to make 100 million tonnes of synthetic fertiliser. That's the only reason why we've been able to keep these yields up. And at the same time, all of us are pissing our nutrients down the drain. We need to start thinking about the fact that, we need to get our nutrients back into our soil. We need to stop them. And I'd love to do the numbers on a place like the Hyatt here. That is an incredible amount of nutrients that those guys are now diverting from landfill or diverting from waste to energy. And it's going back onto people that are supplying them with, vegetables, fruit, going back into our soil.
So you have restaurateurs, you have hotel operators in the room. Traditionally, I think the mentality has been that this approach to creating, generating food is good at PR marketing stunt, but ultimately will be a loss leader financially. What would you say to that?
Well, one example, which is kind of the first thing that I worked on, was the wine on tap, which now is pretty much every restaurant in Melbourne's got wine on tap. And the toughest thing was convincing the winemakers. And I spoke to about 8 different winemakers, and Phil Sexton, who owns Giant Steps, and Innocent Bystander, he said, fuck it, I'll do it. It's not going to work. It's the dumbest thing I'm ever going to do because the wine's not going to be on the table. No one will remember my brand. It's about branding, right? Well, it turned into something really big for him because everybody went nuts on wine on tap. His Moscato and all these other things that went on tap. And there was another, Carlisle Wines and, there were 3 winemakers. They ended up really profiting from it. And then about 4 years after we started doing it, Phil had worked out that it was 24% cheaper for him to sell wine in a keg, because what he was doing was sending the wine to South Australia, to Australia's biggest bottling plant, to get bottled from the Yarra Valley. The transport involved in sending it there got bottled, then transported back to the vineyard. Then it would get transported out, and then we would have to pay someone to come and collect the glass that no one wants is going into road base. So that's a 24% saving. It's about 20% cheaper to supply milk in bulk. I'm so proud to say that stuff that I nearly went to jail for, I was doing only it's 2010, it's 8 years ago. McDonald's is now installing these systems. These systems are not only better for the environment because they don't generate waste, but they're much better because you're not opening a fridge 400 times a day, getting bottles of milk out to make a coffee. That milk stays refrigerated from the farm to point of disperse. The saving with McDonald's will be massive. Then there's the using sustainable packaging, like reusable packaging. You go with an empty truck to go and pick up from a producer. There's no reason why those empty crates can't go back and get reused. It's just those simple kind of things, and they are actually cheaper as well.
Thank you. So these are the 1 degrees of change that really we can see the hotel operators and the restaurateurs looking at.
We actually spoke about Room of the Water as well.
Yep.
So the thing that, like Neil Perry, I love him to bits because you give him a piece of information, and if he sees that it makes sense, bang, he's onto it and he gets it done, And then all of a sudden you've got some of the best restaurants in Australia, a whole group just doing the same thing. The one thing that I couldn't get him on was the water. And it really bugged him as well. And then one day he called me and said, I've worked out I make $3.5 million just from bottled mineral water across the group. I can't stop doing the mineral water, to your system. Then eventually he adopted the system. And we worked out that just for Rockpool in Melbourne, he was going through 500 bottles of mineral water a day. That's 33 shipping containers in 10 years of mineral water that didn't need to come from Italy. And what he ended up adopting was a filtering system of Melbourne water, which is fantastic water anyway. It got filtered, all carbonated, and people were happy to pay for it. He didn't lose his revenue. He generates no waste, and he doesn't have to have his staff, having to cart in hundreds and hundreds of boxes of mineral water every week, or get rid of them. That's just one classic scenario where it's much cheaper, and the clients, the customers, are demanding it and love that he's done that. And it's something that all hotels could easily do.
So the hoteliers can start to take on board the conversations that you're having. I imagine also there's an opportunity for the hotels themselves and the brands that they have to cross-pollinate the locations within Australia for growing various produce in between the actual venues themselves.
Yeah.
So you can then have a collective between the hotels.
And yeah, also when you go zero waste, you need to do it locally. Like a brilliant chef that used to work for me, Douglas McMaster, he's got a silo in Brighton in the UK. And he's frustrated because I don't have good winemakers, so he actually has a sailing boat that sails from Europe to Brighton once a month for coffee, chocolate, and wine. And the boat goes back, it goes to Noma in Copenhagen and goes to Brighton and goes to Silo, 2 places. But the boat goes back with empty bottles of wine, and then they refill the bottles of wine and they have the canisters for the coffee, and it's a zero waste movement. For us, it's easier. Here in Melbourne, we've got pretty much everything here. There's even some good coffee being grown. So it's much easier for us to be zero waste. And then there's that idea that it's a cheaper economic version of serving wine. I'll give you we spoke about this before as well. Neil wasn't convinced about the wine on tap thing either, I remember Terry Durack gave us 16.5 out of 20 for our restaurant in Sydney, and he said, fucking hell, I've got $12 million worth of wine sitting in my restaurant. You got the same score from Terry Durack as what I did, and you've got this bloody natural wine on tap. What's going on there? He was joking, of course, but he was sitting for the Food and Wine Festival. Renee Redzepi was doing a dinner in 2012 in the restaurant, a zero waste dinner, and the wines that we had were really good wines. And I got Vanya Cullen to put a wine in a keg. And the keg was worth an absolute fortune, of course, but it wasn't until that moment that Neil realised it's just the idea that he thought it was a cheap way of doing it. What you can do, especially like a hotel group like this, you can actually collaborate with some brilliant winemakers, and because it's in a keg, it's much easier to do blends with specials. What I used to do in restaurants is, all right, let's play around. And so people would come in, and the house wine would be a collaboration between maybe sometimes 2 or 3 different winemakers. It's much easier, much cheaper, and it means you can actually spend more on the wine. We did gin, brilliant gins. I mean, when I started 2009, there was only really one guy making, Jason Chan, making a local gin. Now there's dozens. Vodka, you can collaborate with these guys because they're local. And that's really, I think I heard David speak before about you go to a place because you want a local experience. People come to Melbourne, they don't want to drink gin from London, they want to drink gin that's made here. And that's by adopting these zero waste approaches, you actually get the community, you get to understand the local soybean grower, the local guy that's growing rice and wheat and barley and oats and yeah.
And I think from a design perspective, as a designer, that's every time your approach to design a new hotel or you're looking at a refresh, the conversation is always now around the locality, the placemaking, telling the story of why the product is within the environment that it is from a hotel, which really lends itself to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The other thing we were talking about earlier on was the expensive wines, and this approach works for the generation that's currently going out to eat, but the younger generation that are coming up, we were talking about access over ownership and the generation that doesn't want to own things. So the approach of getting their food delivered, staying in hotels where everything is locally sourced is something that the hotel operators should really be taking on board now for the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, we spoke about, I'm quite close with, I go to Holland every year. My sister still lives there and I've got lots of family there. So that economy in Holland hasn't grown really for the last 10 years. dived obviously in 2008, and it's only just starting to recover. And my observation from an outsider's point of view is that the Dutch are just sick of consuming shit. And it's been happening in Japan for 20 years. You know, that generation that came after the 80s just went, my mum and dad just bought stuff and just worked constantly. And guess what? The next generation rebelled and stopped buying stuff. And economists were saying, yeah, but, you know, Japan's going so poorly. Well, no, but it was just a new paradigm. And I think that's happening all over the Western world. And it's, yeah, people, I know the Lowies are getting out of retail, and I know some families, I'm quite close with families that are heavily invested and own a lot of retail. And they're saying their biggest competitor in the retail space is the experience. People would prefer to go and spend money on an experience than prefer to go shopping and buy something. And I think if you're in the hotel space, it's a pretty bloody good thing to hear.
So when you look at the metrics behind the growth in certain hotel sectors, I think one of the percentages that came out was the growth of family holidays is at 4.8 against 3.8 for the growth of all the other sectors. There's a wonderful opportunity then to really bring a family into a hotel environment or a resort environment to be involved within the cultivation of some of the produce that they may already have, and then ultimately that night or a couple of nights later be involved in tasting the food that they've taken part in harvesting.
Yeah.
So there's
like we're going to Holland in a couple of months' time with my family, and you know, we'll spend time with my family. But on the way back, we're going to Sri Lanka, and the only reason why we're going there is because I've just heard so many of my friends rave about this particular chef who takes you as a whole family, and you just, for a couple of days, you just forage, dig, and then cook this incredible Sri Lankan food. That's the reason why we're going. That's an experience. Isn't that what we're talking about here? You know, it's, and you know, those, our kids will have that for the rest of their lives. It's something that, you know, you can never take away.
So before I open it up to the floor for questions, one final maybe tidbit or advice you could give to the hoteliers. We all know about not using your towels every single day, be saving them, don't change your linen and laundry. But from the food perspective, 1 degree of change at a time, what would you like to see the hotel industry as a whole taking on board?
I almost always get my inspiration from the past. So whether you're in Japan or whether you're in Melbourne or whether you're in Holland or wherever you are, I think that there's so much you can take from past traditions, and those traditions are quite unique, almost always incredibly unique. You know, one thing Weston Price discovered visiting, 45 different primitive populations across the globe, that not one of them had the same diet. Every single diet was completely different to another population. So he said there is no such thing as the perfect diet, or it was just about nutrient density. But what excited him was how different everybody, because they if they were close to the sea, they harvested from the sea. If they were inland, you might have used goats or whatever. And I think that there's a lot of inspiration to be found, and sometimes it's just in a bookstore with a book that's 150 years old, or there's and with the internet today, there's so many people finding out these beautiful stories about how things were traditionally done 500 or 1,000 years ago, and that's how you I think localize something, get inspired, and then find sustainable alternatives for whatever it is that you're trying to do.
That's the wonderful democracy of intellect that the smartphone now provides, is that you can be in Sao Paulo and be influenced by a restaurant or what a hotel's doing in the middle of Sri Lanka and vice versa. And hopefully then we all move forward together. So do we have any questions from the room? Yes, Howard.
We have one. We have a couple, actually. The first one is for Joost. When are you going to write a book?
I'm hopeless at writing a book. I'm good at writing Instagram
Get
posts.
somebody else to write the book.
Yeah, I have spoken to a few publishers from overseas. I will probably may end up just doing a whole book on my Instagram posts. My friends call them bedtime stories.
Yes.
Okay, it doesn't say who sent that question in, but thank you. Another one for Joost. Technologies in terms of existing plumbing systems, reusing grey water. I know this does exist, but on a commercial scale? Have you done one, or can you reference one?
Well, the one that I'm proposing to use is called a lifesaver system, which is actually not really for grey water. It was designed following the tsunami in 2004. Pritchard, what's his name? The English inventor, saw pallets of bottled water being dropped off. And he thought, well, they drink the bottle of water, tomorrow they need another bottle of water. So he invented a bottle that filters 6,000 litres of water. So when you drop off 1,000 bottles, that means everyone's got enough water to last them at least a year. Just they can go up to the ocean, they can go to the most polluted river in the world, and it'll take out 99.9% of impurities. That system was then developed into a jerry can and into a system that actually cleans 1 million litres of water. And that's what I'm experimenting with using on my grey water.
That was a great question and answer. The question came from Ali, so thank you, Ali. I think really in terms of Joost, that's it. Maybe some others from the floor. Matt?
Any questions from the floor? I have been reliably informed that there are prizes for the best questions to be handed out.
There's somebody up there. Yeah.
Lady at the back.
Here we go. Here we go.
I guess my question was just with more and more people choosing to not have dairy, either for the fact that it makes them sick or for the fact that it's has a lot of cruelty behind it, and then there's this big rise in all the milk alternatives, so almond milk and coconut milk and all those sorts of things. Obviously, they need to be grown, and that's going to help, I guess, make it worse for the soil. Which do you think is the lesser of two evils for kind of the earth and the soil moving forward?
Well, there's about 5.5 billion people that drink raw milk every day. So that's unpasteurized milk. 4.5 billion drink raw goat's milk, and about 1 billion drink raw cow's milk. And then there's about 700 million people that drink pasteurized milk, mostly in Europe, America, and Australia, and New Zealand. I personally wouldn't drink pasteurized milk. I've never allowed my children to drink pasteurized milk because I think it's toxic to us. I think that unpasteurized raw milk is possibly the best food on the planet. It has between 800 and 1,000 different species of bacteria, so it's the most probiotic drink on the planet. And a really amazing study that was done by the Swiss government. The Swiss are really suffering from their children suffering from asthma and allergies. Allergies is a big problem in Switzerland. So they started to try and understand why. And they studied the Amish in America who originate from Switzerland. And they worked out that genetically they're actually still identical. But the Amish don't suffer from asthma and allergies. So then they started to study the food, and they realized that the biggest difference was that they consumed raw milk. And so they did a study called the Gabrielle Study, which provided 4,000 children on farms and 4,000 children living in Vienna with unpasteurized milk. And both groups developed the same immunity to allergies and asthma. And they realized, because they thought maybe the Amish living on farms, that's how they built their immunity, and they realized it was actually the raw milk that was providing immunity. And you've got to remember that a cow eats something that we don't eat, grass. And they also provide fertility. So without cows, Africa would starve pretty much within weeks. And I'd say most of India would starve too. So I think that the problems that people have with drinking milk is because we've messed it up, personally. And then we've got the other problem that Denmark and Holland and Germany are feeding grains and soybeans to cows, which makes them sick, which means that they need to have antibiotics added to them. And that, again, is the craziest idea in the world, right? They're cutting down rainforests in Argentina and in Brazil to feed cows in Denmark. We made soya milk in our restaurants, made it ourselves because Bonsoy and the companies refused to supply us in reusable vats, and Bonsoy and Synovus. But yeah, if you can somehow source unpasteurized raw milk, that is pretty much, I think, the best food you can possibly give your children and yourself.
We do have another question. I've received a question. You mentioned Rialto Towers before. Have you done a project that big?
No.
What's holding you back? You're
Can't-
waiting for a designer in
I'm
the
trying
room.
to convince Lorenz Guolo, who half owns the building, to...
Right.
I think it'd be a great building to actually put a skin on. It's a really good building. It was really well built. It's got really good facade, a really good skin. And so it's 25, 30 years old, I think, and still performs really well. But I love the idea of retrofitting it and making it, turning it into something truly amazing that, doesn't generate any waste and grows its own food.
But why do you think, I work for hotel owners, and I know there's always a return on investment angle. Why do you think there's probably, I'm not sure, there may be somebody in the room that's designed something, but why do you think there's reluctance to...
I just think it's time. It just takes time. My dad used to say to me, I used to get really frustrated that in 2010, I said on the Today Show that by 2020, every town in Australia will have a bakery that fresh mills, stone grinds its own flour. We're now in 2018, and only my local town has just had a bakery open with a stone mill. I think it might be 2020, might be a bit, optimistic. But my dad used to say, it just takes time, and it does. I mean, I really believe that the momentum around zero waste and in 2030, the place will look very different.
So are you willing to invest yourself in that kind of...
I've invested a lot of money in myself, my own ideas, yeah.
Right. So all the designers...
Everything I've done, I've basically done out of my own pocket.
Okay.
So,
but all the designers and architects in the room today could come to you and there'd be a JV in there somewhere, right? Just thought I'd throw it out there, guys. Any more questions?
I guess one of the biggest issues that was already sort of touched on is getting this to scale, like putting compost back into the soil, building the nutrient profile of the soil back up to give us good food. I wonder if, 'cause at the same time we're seeing this rise of technology and connectivity, if that can hold hands with what we need to do with our food in connecting lots of small dots. So at the moment, instead of everyone going to huge farms or corporations to get their food and logistics and all of that, if to supply the need, you need lots of little people all connected. Right? So you've got your own grower and you've got your own supplier of milk and this and that, and everyone builds that network.
That's a really good question, and I think that is, in my opinion, in 25 years' time, there won't be supermarkets. They might be even quicker than that. They'll be gone. And a place like Melbourne will not be relying on its outer districts to grow food. All the food will be grown within Melbourne. And I keep saying to my children, your job will be to replant all of the forests that have been cut down, because we won't... It's so easy to grow really nutrient-dense food on a micro level, and we've got millions of people that are going to be looking for work, and there's nothing more satisfying than on 100 square metres of dirt growing enough food to feed, a dozen families. And that's the future, I have no doubt, and it's already happening. And the fastest growing agricultural movement is micro farms, and they also tend to be the most profitable. Now, I've got one where a friend of mine's got 12 cows. He supplies 400 families with milk from 12 Jersey cows. And there's no inputs. He doesn't buy anything. He doesn't buy grain. The cows just get grass. He doesn't deliver. Everybody drives to him. And there's 4,500 dairy farms in Italy now with vending machines. This movement is really, it seems slow to us now. But like one classic example I give to, especially at school, to kids, a lot of kids feel really disillusioned about where we're at. I built my place 10 years ago. We moved in 10 years ago. There were 65,000 houses in Australia with solar 10 years ago. There's 1.8 million today. That's in 10 years. So it's amazing what can happen in 10 years.
Firstly, I just want to fangirl and say I've been a follower of yours for a really long time, and I'm totally on board with, you know, a lot of what you talk about. I garden my own, I grow my own veggies. I was just having a chat with a designer friend of mine out the front about swapping my pickled olives for his olive oil, and, you know, so I really believe in the slow food movement. But I did study integrative nutrition, which is a little bit of a hot topic, but, you know, something you learn about in that is the politics behind food. And I don't mean to be a bubble burster, but 25 years without you know, for a timeline of not having supermarkets, I feel like you become so involved in these communities where you are with like-minded people that, you know, believe the same philosophies as you, and you're fortunate enough to have the influence over people that can actually change the game. But when you're talking about like the hordes and masses of, you know, for want of a better word, blind people that are still buying Kellogg's food and still don't understand that the majority of food in supermarkets is literally owned by like 10 companies. How do you educate those people so you do have that move back to the slow food movement?
Well, Coca-Cola's sales dropped by 15% last year. You know, it just takes time. And it's not going to look like the way it looks like now. So the average lifespan of an Australian home is 38 years. So that's crazy, right? And 38 years is the average lifespan of a house. The houses that we build over the next 25 to 30 years will not look like the houses that we have now. They'll have rooftop gardens, they'll have atriums that are glazed, there'll be systems that recycle water. There won't be, your sewage won't go into a sewage system. There'll be systems that reintegrate it back in. Aquaponic systems. I believe that on 100 square metres of soil, with a home, with a family living there, you can grow between 3,000 and 5,000 kilos of food per annum and provide enough nutrients to sustain and feed a family.
But how do you make that a mainstream movement?
But you've just got to do it. And then you do one, and then you do another. I've been trying to get this thing up. I mean, that's what the greenhouse was actually about. It was never meant to be a restaurant. It was supposed to be an example of a home that grows its own food. In 2008, I had to add the restaurant element to it because I couldn't financially make it stack up. I still lost $500,000 doing that project, but people got so excited by the wine on tap and the composting and the stone grinding, all the other elements, they totally forgot about this idea that the building had actually 100 tons of soil on the roof. I mean, we harvested an incredible amount of food off that building at Fed Square. On 1 square metre, we harvested 35 kilos of potatoes.
Matt or Joost, a question. Why haven't disposable coffee cups been banned?
I don't have a
given
fucking clue.
2 billion go into landfill apparently to this delegate. You have a question?
Did anybody see the war on waste last year? Yeah, so we filled the tram with coffee cups. That's 20 minutes. Every 20 minutes we fill a tram with 60,000 coffee cups every 20 minutes. For me, I get emailed lots of times, I've got an alternative. I've got a compostable alternative to a coffee cup. That is actually not my issue. My issue is that the culture is wrong. The walking around with food, the walking around with coffee is actually the problem for me. So most wine gets harvested with a machine. Most wine gets made with a machine. Almost all coffee gets picked by hand. I mean, it's less than 10% of coffee in the world that gets consumed that actually gets picked by machine. So it's all picked by hand. It's mostly small roasted and hand selected. Yet we wouldn't think about drinking a glass of wine out of a plastic coated paper cup. So for me, it's an insult to the food. You see it when you go to Paris or Italy. You see the Italians looking around at all the tourists going, look at these dickheads. They're walking around holding... And look, step outside, look in Collins Street. You've got all these people walking around holding phones and coffees. It's like, can't we sit down and take 5 minutes to actually enjoy the beverage, have a chat? It's the culture that's wrong. And it's only happened in 10 years. 10 years ago, we didn't have this culture of walking around with coffees.
Okay, last question.
It's not an answer, but it's the best. I don't understand it.
In the context of hospitality, which is what we're talking about today, and in the context of design, what's the low-hanging fruit? What can we as designers, what can we as a community be advising our owners, be advising in terms of ROI? What's the low-hanging fruit that we can say, right, this is a cheap, quick win, that we can get this in to start the momentum? I know, you know, you're talking about Grand Hyatt with the composters, but we're all using plastic bottles right now. So what is the low-hanging fruit that we can start with a client, let's say, is a little bit more resistant to this type of movement, but to still try to bring it forward?
Well, I've designed a dozen buildings in the last 10 years and built, and restaurants and stuff like that. And my number one rule is endlessly recyclable materials or diversion from landfill. So if you say that to most young designers, they get pretty bloody excited. It has to be endlessly recyclable or diverted from landfill. So I'll give you one example that I never use FSC certified timber because I think that is the biggest green scam in the world today. The biggest problem that we face is the loss of biodiversity. So when we plant a plantation forest, you've got one single species being planted over and over again. And I've walked through plantation forests in Brazil, in Europe, in New Zealand, Australia, Asia, and guess what? You see no birds, you see no animals, nothing exists in a plantation forest. So us having on the front cover of wallpaper everything made out of timber, and these young designers coming out of university thinking that timber is carbon neutral because it's locking up carbon as it's growing, is the craziest idea I've ever heard. Diverting from landfill, so using timber that's resourced from pellets or timber that comes from sustainably harvested forests, which is only about 5% of the total. It's crazy, but most of the privately owned forests in America, they can't sell their timber. They may selectively harvest one log out of a hectare every year, and they can't sell it because I think people like you don't understand what it is that they're trying to do. They're trying to retain biodiversity, have a sustainable business at the same time. So when you start talking about laying those ground rules and giving that to a designer, you will be blown away with what they come back with, because most young people get really excited by that as a concept, and you will end up with something really original, often something really local, and something that's really sustainable. That's if you were going to start from scratch, that's what I would do. And then if you want to do something on the waste side, from the food and beverage side, look at where most of your waste is being generated. And it's not that hard to find a solution. Like, I had not one bin pickup in 3 years from a bloody busy restaurant. No wheelie bin pickup in 3 years. We generated no waste.
Right. Sorry, my microphone's not working, but Joost, thank you so much for what was an incredibly inspiring conversation.